Welcome to the panel room. I'm joined today by 5 wonderful authors, and we will be talking about world building, specifically fantasy world building and economics. So before we get started, let's go around the room and have everyone introduce themselves. And we'll start with you, Jeannie.
I'm Jeanne Adams. I write urban fantasy, paranormal romantic suspense, and space adventure with my friend Nancy Northcott.
All right, perfect. And then Ginny.
Hi, I'm Gini Koch. I write the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series for Doll Books and a ton of other things. I write in every genre and I write under 7 pen names.
All right, perfect. Lee?
I'm Lee Modesitt, and well, let's put it this way. I've written a lot of books along the way. There's something like 5 fantasy series and 3 or 4 science fiction series. I started out in hard science fiction. And for the record, I actually started out as a professional economist before I started writing.
All right. Jim?
I'm Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, fantasy, urban fantasy, a little bit of this, that, and the other. I also write nonfiction and in business, economic spaces, privacy, and technology.
All right. And finally, Gail.
Hi, I'm Gail Z Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more. I've got 4 epic fantasy series, and the economics piece definitely plays a role in those. And as Morgan, I write urban fantasy, mail-mail, paranormal romance. So yeah, a little of a lot of things.
All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and I'll start with you, Jeannie. When world building, we all think about characters, everything that you normally think of, setting, characters, all of that, but why economy?
Well, I mean, I think you have to understand at least the basics of how your world's economy works. Well, I guess one of the reasons I'm on this panel is I was in economic development for a long time. I won't say how many years, it was a long time. And you have to know what's the method of exchange? How do you barter goods and services? How do you pay for that horse? Horses are expensive. You know, if you're a pre-industrial world, if you're building a pre-industrial world, what's the main order of currency? What's the value? I mean, is it gold? Is it platinum? Is it horses? And knowing those things is going to shape your character's world. So to me, knowing that about economies, how many kingdoms are there? How many principalities are there? How many democracies are, those sorts of things. You kind of have to have that in mind as you build your story. Otherwise, you got to backstop everything.
All right. Anything to add, Jenny?
A little bit. I think I'm an extreme linear writer, so like everything else, the economics comes in as I need it to, but it's always there because just like Jeannie said, you have to know how much things are. What's worth fighting for? What's worth killing for? How do you eat? Do you just get food at the side of the road because it's that kind of world? And also, what's going to motivate your characters? Are you going to go on an epic quest for $5? Probably not. Are you going to go on an epic quest to save the world? Well, maybe, but what's the other upside? Oh, here's a vast treasure. What's the treasure? What is it worth? Is magic something you can barter, or is magic part of your world? And this, honestly, I think this applies to more than just fantasy. I think every world building, as someone who writes in all the genres, every world has to have some kind of economics, because otherwise, how are your characters functioning? If you're I write space opera, how did you get the ship? Okay, how do you fuel the ship? How do you work? What is your job? How do you make what you're making, and why? Who's doing the grunt work? Who's doing the nice work? So I think it's something you have to think about, even if it's not something you're writing down, in an outline format. But I think every world, regardless of genre, needs some sort of economic background.
Lee, you said you started out in economics before writing.
Yep.
Did you automatically throw it in with your first book, or did it take a while to realize the importance of
Actually,
it?
my first story was about an economist. Like to add a couple of other things though along the line. One of which is a lot of people don't monetize magic, but it's a skill and you need to monetize it in the sense of what's it worth? Where is it worth? What forms of magic are worth things? And then there is the trope that just drives me totally batshit. And that is you put the untried young mage on the flank of the army and he's going to hold off the invaders. No, there's no army general out there or marshal or whatever who's going to trust his men to something untried. They may let him go out there and try a sacrifice thing with the troops behind him, but they're not going to risk anything. And the other thing I'll just bring as a basic building block is there are only two things in any economy that really underlie the value of anything, at least with human beings. One is it useful? Is it a tool? The other is it entertaining? If you break that down in any society, you will find that anything that lasts is one of the two, if not both. We are a tool using species. And if it's not used in a tool, it's going to die out, or if it doesn't entertain people.
So rarity would fall under entertainment in a sense. If you've got something that's very rare, but not necessarily useful, that would be.
Then why do you care?
Okay.
But entertainment has always been a form of any human society. One of the oldest artifacts they've found is a bone flute. So it's a definite need for at least a human society.
I think that speaks to your comment about magic too, is whether it is used in whatever society you create, whether it's used for something useful, like being the experienced mage on the flank guarding the soldiers, men or women, or whether it's for entertainment, it has value. And so I just wanted to say I totally agree about monetizing magic. That's a very important thing.
Well, and if I look at economics, and a lot of the time, depending on the world you're in, the economics also help bring the character and make that world a little bit more real. Because if you're writing urban fantasy, we're used to kind of the broke PI urban fantasy nitty gritty thing. Am I broke? Can I at least go buy a sandwich? Am I trying to negotiate for the latest deal? Or am I dealing with people that are extraordinarily wealthy? And so you can see money moving that way. But if you're then dealing with like a fantasy world where you're talking about, throw a coin to your Witcher, economics can tell you a lot about the world you're walking around in, even just the subtle parts of it. Am I foraging off the land? I mean, one of the stories I've got out there, one of the series I've got that is being reworked and may or may not ever see the light of day is about currency manipulation and using cryptocurrencies and stock manipulation. I mean, so the people that are in this are playing money games. So the economy, even though it's relatively modern economy, is very tied in. If you look at pretty much any system, if you're looking at it, even if it's hard sci-fi, looking at how money moves and what people consider valuable tells you a lot about the society.
The other thing to keep in mind is in the US and Canada and Australia and maybe Russia, we get used to having most of a continent to ourselves with a whole lot of different resources and sprawling across vast distances, throwing China there too. But if you look at most of the rest of the countries in the world, they're not nearly as big. They don't have every type of resource there is to have. They may have timber, or they may have iron, or they may have coal. Pick and choose a couple, but they probably don't have some of everything. So that's going to make a difference right there in who they trade with, how important they're seen by their trading partners, who has jobs, what's valued, who's making the money. who's out of luck. So that's an important piece. It also depends on what level in society your viewpoint characters are, how knowledgeable they are or need to be about the economy. So if you've got the guy who's shoveling out the manure in the horse barns, all he cares about is that people keep having horses, so he still has a job to shovel out the crap. If you're talking about the king or high nobility or merchants, they're going to be very concerned about trading prices and trading partners, and are any of their trading partners backstabbing each other and undercutting the prices, and what about pirates, and what about smugglers, and what about, you know, what about all kinds of things that the average guy doesn't know about and doesn't care about. So that not only shapes who the characters are, but it shapes how they think. And if you kind of think about the real world, most people don't know what the Federal Reserve does. They really don't understand interest rate fluctuations. They can't define what a hedge fund manager does. But depending on the story you're trying to tell and who your characters are, understanding that might make a huge difference. It might be at the crux of the story. So it all depends on what your resources are and what you're trying to do with them, and who you're seeing the world, whose eyes you're seeing the world through.
I'd like to throw in a couple of, shall we say, riffs on what you said, Gail. One is geography. I can't even think of the guy's, Jared, anyway, I must have one of those senior moments, but in any case, he made the point that one of the differences between Europe and China in the early years was that China was able to unify because all the rivers, for the most part, ran east-west, and there were no great geographical separations. Europe, on the other hand, had mountains that ran north-south, as did the rivers, and it broke up the countryside a great deal more, which is why the Chinese had one of the first real empires. The next one was probably the Egyptians, and again, you basically had the entire watershed of the Nile creating, should we say, a homogeneous empire. Whereas if you get areas where, as you pointed out, things are broken up, you've got a real problem. The other point I wanted to mention is I did something about 30 years ago, which at the time I'd never seen done before. I told a story from the viewpoint of a ruler who was trying to figure out the balance between tariffs and taxes and whether he could afford the army to protect him from the invaders without killing the traders. Traders as in people trading things, not people trying to undermine him.
Well, and I think, Lee brings something up, which is trade routes, which has also made a big difference in who thrives and who doesn't, and how those routes change over time. So if a river shifts its course, a formerly prosperous trading city can find itself literally high and dry. If there is civil unrest or natural disaster that destroys a trading city, someone else may build up a replacement before the original gets back on its feet. That's what happened here in Charlotte, where before the Civil War, Charlotte was, as George Washington called it, a trifling place. Notice that I know that because people are still sore about it. Statesville up the road was the big center for commerce, except because Charlotte was a trifling place, nobody burned it during the war. That, however, did not save Statesville, which did burn. Guess what? All the trade shifted to Charlotte because it might be trifling, but it wasn't in smoking ruins, and Statesville never recovered. You can read about how bitter they are about that on their city website, by the way, on their welcome page.
Or
talk to anybody who lives there.
Yeah. Well,
You'll hear about it. But I mean, so there's something that persists over 150 years in memory, shaping the people.
Mm-hmm.
And it was all because of civil unrest or a war. So that also factors into who has the power and which
Right.
cities are the next side.
And I wanted to make a comment going way back to what you said at the start of your part, Gail, where the guy shoveling the horse poop only cares about horses. I would argue that. I would say that what he cares about is there a way to get a job better than shoveling poop? Okay, so that does mean he has to have, even if your character is a humble stable boy, he has to have some idea of what's out there, so that when the wizard comes and says, humble stable boy, you have this great opportunity, that he knows whether or not that opportunity is all that great. You know, you can shovel poop for better people is not that great an offer. You never have to shovel poop again. And in fact, you'll be at this strata, and him understanding it or not understanding it will shape what you do with the character, but you, the author, need to understand it. So you know whether that character is making a wise decision, a brave decision, or a foolish decision, and so forth.
You never have to shovel poop again, and you can have your own horse.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good offer. But again, he has to know the value of a horse, you know, because there's a point, if it's your horse, you may still have to shovel its poop, but it's
True.
yours versus
The
somebody
downside
else's.
is the downside is the bard you have to keep up with, and the,
Well, there's
Right.
another factor in here too we haven't talked about, and that is how structured the society is. You may be in an Indian society where you've got untouchables that are doomed to shovel poop no matter what happens to them.
Mhm.
And
Well-
so social structure is determined often by economics, but sometimes it's ironclad.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Gail, that also leads into another issue is what's the effect in whatever world you're creating, what's the effect of colonialism? Has one nation conquered everybody, but then that all collapsed and now they're all nation states? Do you have some people who are continually trying, like you mentioned, Lee, the untouchables who are trying constantly to fight to change that rigid structure? And what are the forces working for or against them? You know, if all the untouchables suddenly get magic, what does that make them? So it, obviously for all of us, it depends on the story we're creating, what we have to know and what we have to do. But I think one of the most underlying things is that there are things you have to think about. You may
Well-
start with the story, as Jenny said, you have to start with this, may start with the story, but at some point along the road, you have to go, okay, how am I going to do this?
Well, you know, Lee brought up the idea of rivers and transportation, but climate also plays a huge piece,
Yeah.
as does geology. You know, if you've got an agricultural society in a place with a nearly ideal climate to raise crops that everybody else wants and other people can't raise for themselves, that's important. What happens if you get a boll weevil? You know, what happens if you get corn smut and it wipes out the crop?
Okay,
What
Well-
happens if you get floods or hail? You know, those kinds of things matter economically and have wiped out entire economies in very short notice. The
I
other
want to
piece,
throw in an
what
economic.
can you, oh, go ahead. What can you actually mine there? There's a geologist who does a course for writers on geology for authors, so that you aren't setting coal mines or ruby mines or diamond mines in places where, geologically it could never be. And so that's something else to think about. What can you dig up, or what's naturally occurring? I'm sorry, Lee, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one basic economic point, because this is about the economics. The one thing you have to have for any society that's got any level of technology is what's called an agricultural surplus. Basically, your farmers or whoever's providing food and what have you has got to produce more than enough than just feeding themselves. Because without that, you can't have tradesmen, you can't have an advanced economy and what have you. And of course, we see this in a lot of cases. If you take a look at the Mayans, for example, their agricultural surplus was based on raised beds and farming, which was fine until they had literally years of drought. And all of a sudden, it wiped out their agricultural surplus so badly that they never recovered.
Well, and one other thing I would add to this as well is the economy also can be almost a character into and of itself. You can be setting up a story where you've got somebody that is the great evil antagonist king, but if that antagonist king is over, you know, a fiefdom in England in 1400s, you at least may have some option to go forage off the land and try to escape. Whereas if that king that's ruling things is on Mars and part of the economy is driven for water and air, your ability to escape or go elsewhere could be really limited. But the major, the major commodities are, can you get something to eat? Can you get something to drink? And can you breathe? So, I mean, those are economic factors that are the basics of life. And I think that's a part of what we see is, what do you have to fight for to get to keep going? And then the second thing is, what do I need to get to be able to accomplish the mission, whatever it is?
Well, and another piece here that overlays it is, what are the cultural or religious or societal taboos that may keep you from optimizing something that would otherwise be considered a neutral resource? So if your religion won't let you eat a certain type of animal, probably opening up a chain of restaurants that serves that animal is not going to be economically good for you. If your religion or your cultural taboos believe that going into the deep places of the earth to bring out coal or rubies or whatever brings bad luck and invites, demonic catastrophe, mining is probably not going to be your forte. Now, that means you're ignoring a resource, but you're also sitting on top of something that somebody who is more agnostic says, I'll take my chances with the demon, give me the rubies. And now they have a reason to want your land or your cows or your pigs or your sheep or whatever it is you're not using.
I think when you're building characters, you have to start, fundamentally, if you really want to go to the basics, you have to sort of start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food and shelter and water and, safety and all those sort of things. But once you get to those upper echelons, like I think, Jenny, you said it, is that once you're starting looking at, is your character the king, or is your character the queen, or is your character the ruling junta, then that structure is different from, I'm slaving away in the stable scooping poop and I can see the stars, versus I own the stars and they bow down to me. Looking at that versus, and also, as Gail says, looking at the religion, how is that hemming you in? Lee, you mentioned the Egyptians, their whole society was daily ruled by various rituals to various gods. And so, especially the ruling class. And so how does that then decay your society when you become so hidebound with those things that you can't break free for the good of your people? The Mayans are the same, if you can't break free of those rituals and things for the good of your people, or you can't decide to move elsewhere because you got a drought, how does that, and you mentioned it, Gail, as trade routes in this, like I was thinking about the Silk Road as you talked about that. Mm-hmm. Innumerable either wars or geography issues, volcanoes, landslides, changed the Silk Road several times along the continuum of history. And that can be the pivot point of your story too.
Well, and another go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, I was going to say, I do want to make a quick pause here for any more neophyte or new or aspiring authors that are listening to this. When we are talking about this, most of this will never be on the page. You're never going to write it. You have to know it. You have to know how it works so that you can understand all the various characters and their motivations. But we are in no way suggesting that your first several chapters of anything or describe your socioeconomic setup. There's nothing, well, no, there are things more boring. The geological setup is more boring, but you're coming in a really close second or third. So what this is really things that we feel that you as authors need to be knowing about your worlds in whatever level it is necessary for you to know them, but your reader is going to discover them through how your characters act and think, not the king in your story isn't going to stop for a moment and discuss, unless it's part of the story. Lee's story that he referenced, that's part of the story. Can I do these things? Okay. But if that's not really where your story is going, you don't need your king or your stable boy to stop and have a socioeconomic discussion unless it moves your story forward, which in most cases it doesn't.
Now, you know, in my Darkhurst series, it does, because the perfidy of the warring factions on the economy in the rival city-states is a major factor on not only what's driving the plot, but who's hiring the assassins and what do they want. But that's part of the setup for the book, is that it's the Hanseatic League and the Italian city-states with magic. What I was going to say is, part of this also comes down to how you keep what you have. And that depends on how your society is structured. If everything is little fiefdoms with lords who have their own private armies, then you can guard, you know, your crops and your workers and your mines or whatever it is. If your different little villages of hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers, you're stuck with who's in your village and some pointed sticks and maybe some arrows. If you, you know, are you talking about a whole kingdom? Are you talking about a village? Are you talking about someplace that is in such chaos that you basically got Mad Max, where everybody, you've got little tiny pods of people and everybody's out for themselves? That's gonna, I can guarantee you, they're gonna war over scarce resources, whatever is valuable and hard to find. And so how you keep it if you've got it, or you get it if you don't have it, very likely plays into what your plot is and who your heroes and villains are.
Now, kind of going off all of this, for the new for that new author, can we go a little over the evolution of economy? As Lee mentioned, he said starts off with that agricultural surplus, and whether it's useful or entertaining. Where does it go from there, so that, you know, this new author doesn't automatically build a complex system that wouldn't have happened naturally?
It basically, if you will, follows the use of tools. First, you got an agricultural surplus. Then you have, should we say, fairly rough or rude, crude tools. The tools can improve the agricultural production, which then will improve the crafting, which will allow you to have more. It's just sort of a pyramid thing in that sense, but it takes forever. You're not going to get, I've forgotten who it was, who had somebody going back to early Poland and creating a modern economy in 10 years. Won't happen. There's too many little pieces. And the thing about it is, most people don't understand unless they've studied technology. There are very rarely, just out of the blue, my God, I've done this wonderful thing and it's there. It's, most human progress is incremental. I mean, Watt improved the Newcomen engine. Others improved his engine. It took literally 50 years, or actually about 100 years, to get a decent steam engine after the first one. It just doesn't happen overnight.
Well, and one of the other things that you see too is, how can I adapt something that somebody else has built? I mean, I think this is going exactly where you're going, Lee, is a lot of economy is shoot straight up for a period of time through technical innovation. And then you have a long period of where you're expanding on the technology that's been created. I mean, we've been going through that right now with the digital age for the last 50 years, seeing, you know, all sorts of new things innovated, you know, audio files, video files, and then it becomes how many different ways can we use it and craft on it. But I think the other thing that I would look at is, what is the culture you're trying to build? Because what's going to be valued in a tribal culture, let's say that you're doing something that involves a small, you know, ancient tribe, or you're doing something that's mirrored off of a medieval Europe or a medieval culture versus you're doing something that's a futurist culture. What do people value? Because we've got to look at, are your people in a survivalist mode, back to Maslow's hierarchy? Are people just trying to survive? Are they trying to grow and prosper Are they at war? Because all of these things will have a drastic effect on what do I need and what do I need to get by tomorrow, but what do I need to get by, period. So I mean, I
I'd
think
like-
that's,
I'd like to add a quick footnote to that. One of the things, and I ran across this illustration years ago, but in the reign of Louis XIV, Versailles was so cold that wine literally froze on the table. And the problem that you have with a lot of this, a lot of situations like that is you don't realize how interconnected things are. Well, I'll let it go at that.
I was going to say that every time you have a big technological shift, whether it's the Industrial Revolution or the Information Revolution, there are winners and losers. So, you know, the buggy whip manufacturer lost out big time when automobiles came in. The demand fell dramatically. And that can create civil unrest and drive all kinds of undercurrents in a culture on who the haves and have-nots are and who the disenfranchised become. And the other thing that has happened throughout history are these random wild cards, which is like rolling a bad hand of dice or bad roll of dice. So when the Black Plague happened, it killed so many of the serfs that labor became much more scarce, and it helped to undermine the feudal system because the serfs now, it killed off what, 25% of the population? It killed off so many workers that somebody actually had to care about how the workers felt about things. And the workers got a chance to say no, because who else are you going to hire to do it? They all died. Oops.
Well, there's another thing that goes with that, Gail, and that is that because the value of labor went up, it became much more, should we say, cost effective to do machinery. The Chinese at the other side of the thing, they didn't get killed off. Only Mongolia and a little bit north of there really got hit hard by the Black Plague. They had the blast furnace 1,000 years before Europe. They had guns. They had gunpowder, but it never went anyplace because labor was so cheap. Has anybody heard of the Antikythera device?
mm-hmm.
Basically, it's a bronze computer. It was created in 100 BC. The one they found was about 100 AD, but it calculates stuff, and there wasn't sophisticated clockwork to match it in Europe until the 1500s. But the thing is, labor was so cheap for the Romans, nobody cared about using a lot of that technology.
Well, and like I say, we saw a lot of toys during that period of time were developed because either it creates an appearance of power. In other words, you know, we've seen things like the torture devices of the steaming bowl, and you know, the person that would be cooked alive in there that becomes the source of the bowl. We saw the use of a lot of very advanced technology, but only used in very limited ways. Versus when we, you know, one of the things that happens is conflict is actually one of the things that forces growth. Because if I have to innovate the ways that I create things, build things, or even just use what I have in hand in a different way, conflict is, you know, in life is what creates innovation. And that's what we saw happen with China when they, after the Great Wall, they cut off a lot of that conflict, and it also stagnated their development for a very long period of time.
Well, you also see that with medicine. I mean, some of the greatest advances in medicine have come because on the battlefield, you have to make choices. You have to try stuff. You know, first of all, you have to care about your soldiers. They have to be a commodity that's worth saving. And you have to decide, okay, I got to save this guy. How do I do it? Or gal? You know, no matter what your economy is, if there's a limited supply of anything, whether that's warriors or that's rubies, you have to figure out technology to go with it. And as you point out, Jim, so much of that early technology was a novelty, and it was made for the rich, whether that was a self-playing piano or some sort of other toy that then decades, sometimes a century later, like the Anaconda device, people go, wait, was it aliens? Well, probably not, but somebody figured it out, but it didn't have a value at that point. But
Well-
bringing it back down to what Jenny was talking about earlier, for your beginning writer or someone who's written in other ways, but decided, okay, now I'm going to build a world. You know, some of these offshoots and the red herrings and the black swans don't matter nearly as much as the fundamental bricks and mortar machinery. You know, like you said earlier, Jim, cryptocurrency may not matter as much as wheat production if you're building a world in the initial stages. And I think a lot of people get put off by or frightened by, oh my gosh, I might have to do world building. And I don't know, I find it hugely fun. So I don't find it as intimidating, but I think Jenny's right. I think there are a lot of people who might listen to this and go, oh, I can't do that.
Well,
But you can.
there's a simple way of looking at this. Very simple. How do you pay for it and with what?
Mhm. Yeah. I'd also like to say that when we talk about the buggy whips is a great example of something that a new technology destroyed, but you can also do a lot with a technology is mostly destroyed but somehow brought back. And in that I'm talking about, I'm going to use this example, vinyl records were destroyed by the compact disc. CDs killed vinyl, except for rap and hip hop. Rap and hip hop were using records to scratch, so they kept vinyl going long enough so that now there's this resurgence in, oh, it sounds better on vinyl. And there's people are getting record players again. So an entire industry got wiped out, but was held by just a few people who kept it alive to have its renaissance, if you will. So that was all economics. It's all economically driven, but you can also take something and resurge it if you can come up with a reason why somebody kept it going. There was no reason to keep buggy whips going at all. What was the reason for vinyl? A subgroup had found a use for it that wasn't exactly what it was created for, and they kept it going to allow people to say, oh, I like that, nostalgia, oh, it sounds so much better, etc., etc. So you always have those options too, depending on what you want to do with the story.
Well, and I'd
And the
say on
world.
the buggy whip piece, it wasn't that nobody had a use for it, but it changed from being an everyday commodity anybody with a horse needed, or a wagon or a buggy or a carriage, to becoming something adjacent to the playthings of those well off enough to have horses and carriages and racing, when that moved away from a mode of transportation and became the Kentucky Derby, or became, you know, buggy racing, or all of those things. It moved into becoming a specialty luxury item instead of being a commodity like it began.
Well, and I think any story, like Jenny, you bring up a great point, is that any story, if you're building a story around an event, think about the Y2K. When we turned over from 1999 to the year 2000, for those of you who were not alive in that point, there was a great deal of panic because many computers had not been designed to handle shifting to a new century. And so something like that, you then have to go on a search for people who know how to do that thing. And many wonderful fantasy novels and even hard science fiction novels are based on, oh crap, we superseded that technology, but now we need it again. Who knows this thing? Oh, old codger, you know, Jane back in the forest tinkering with her old machines, she still knows. Oh, she suddenly becomes a commodity in and of herself, or her knowledge does. So you're right, Jenny, a lot of times that can be the pivot point of a story. That's super fun, is knowing how to make a buggy whip.
Yeah, and
Suddenly
right now we're working on learning how to freeze the COBOL developers for the Y10K problem, but
I'd like to throw in something else that is both economic and practical. There were until basically roughly 1812, there were very few large standing armies in the world. And there was a very simple reason for this. And that is, how do you feed them?
Yeah.
Well, the French discovered canning, and they actually put out incentives to find a way to preserve food. And the Grand Army was basically fueled and existed because Napoleon had a food supply that wasn't based on, in essence, foraging and destroying everything in his path. And so that's the case of a very small, shall we say, item, but it made possible the growth of massive armies.
Well, it also meant that you couldn't have somebody burning the crops behind them as a fire break. I mean, it meant that that tactic of stopping an army kind of became irrelevant.
Yeah.
So the next question I have is, we've talked about economy, building economies, and most of that tends to be barter, trade, or products. What are the pros and cons of going to a currency in a fantasy world?
Well, it depends on how you want to look at it. But basically, most currencies were either, there have been a couple of places where they were representational. Polynesians used enormous stones to do that. Not terribly practical, and they never moved. The deeds to them just changed. But most currencies were based on the rarity of metals, at least in our world. Copper, silver, gold. I don't know of anybody who minted platinum coins, but there might have been somebody. But that becomes a hard currency, and that has its own problems. Because what happens when you have an expanding economy and there's not enough gold? Well, the price of gold goes up. And then you also have problems like in the 1890s in the United States, where you had in essence, the silver movement, because gold was choking out and making it difficult for working people to actually engage in commerce.
Well, and you know, barter only works up to a point or in dire circumstances, because chickens are difficult to just carry around with you, and potatoes are heavy.
Well, the earliest currency that I know of is back in the Sumerian times. There actually was a counting house out there, and it took in chickens and what have you, and then it issued little ceramic discs or little ceramic figures of chickens or pigs or what have you, which could be traded in as necessary for the actual goods.
Yeah.
It became a bank.
Well, in essence, yes. And for what I remember about it, they actually published what the cross values were, so that there was an equivalent value. So if you had three chits for a chicken, then you also knew how many that counted for a loaf of bread or for other things as well. Because if I remember, they actually have found some published exchange rates for that.
Well, I mean, but in dealing with Jason's question to begin with, this is in essence your transition from barter to a currency.
And then you look at the period with the Templars going to Jerusalem and creating, in essence, a checking system, for lack of better terms, and not quite a fiat currency, but they actually creating the ability. So I'm depositing my gold here. I get a script worth this. I can pick it up when I get to the other end. We've seen a lot of that sort of development of currencies over time.
But you don't have to understand the Federal Reserve to create a banking system in your world.
Mm-hmm.
You do have to understand within your world, and as Jenny says, a lot of this never appears on the page. You just have to know that a trader in wool in your world is a higher status person than a trader in copper, or vice versa. You have to know that, you, the author, have to know that, but you don't necessarily have to put it literally on the page. And as Jenny also said, bore your reader to absolute tears.
Well, and proof that this can be handled simply is the Scooby-Doo episode where in the end, Scooby wins he's the last one who's not chased off the island, and he gets the inheritance, and it's all in Confederate money. And therefore it's worthless. Now, if that can be the punchline on a Scooby-Doo episode, you can deal with economics in your story in such a way that it doesn't need a PhD to understand.
Exactly.
And then there's also, well, there's also books and series like Discworld. One of the things I love about Terry Pratchett and Discworld is the economy is often the punchline and so strong as part of the backstory that if you understand what he's saying, you can pick up an entirely different story. But that's a great kind of almost masterclass in how to create an economy and explain why it matters.
And expand on it. Book after book, and add things in and make them work, well, not always seamlessly, but if they're not working seamlessly, it's because he intends them to not work seamlessly. But yeah, no, Discworld is a really good example of that. Plus you've got magic, and you've got goods and services and everything else, warring countries, different places, religion in the mix. So yeah, no, it's a great place to go to learn. As are, let me do a pitch, Lee's books are also a really good way to learn how to do this very, very well in an entertaining fashion.
Thank you.
That kind of leads me into my last question, and I'll pose it to Gail first because I know she needs to leave soon. Resources for people that want to learn more on how to improve on their world building.
If you have any interest whatsoever in real world history, read real world history in a period and place somewhat analogous to the world you want to build, and figure out how they did it. And crib liberally from real world sources. Research is your best friend. And I do apologize. I have to drop off to run another panel. So thank you to everybody.
Bye, Gail.
Yeah.
Bye, Gail.
So Jeanne,
I'll add
please.
another single book to that. Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yep.
Because that actually touches on the role of something we didn't much talk about, which was health, welfare. We talked about the plague a little bit about pandemics and epidemics, and I mentioned colonialism a little bit, but the health risks that come with it are also world shapers.
So, there's a lot of books out there on economics, and a lot of them are going to be fairly dry. Because I've read a lot of them. But the other thing I would add is this, again, we're kind of back to, especially if you're not wanting to build a heavily economic world, is figure out what you need to make happen in your story and in your world that creates value. If you're writing a heist novel, then a lot of what it can boil down to is, what's the value of the object I'm trying to get to? If we look at Indiana Jones and stealing the idol at the beginning of it, is it the value of the gold? Is it the value of the historical object? Is it the value to the tribe that he's stealing it from? There's a lot of different motivations there that all touch on the economics. Or if we look at, getting down towards the end, the Ark, the historical value, the museum value, the value of the gold and the precious metals, or the value to just like vaporize and melt everyone. There's a lot of different value systems that are right there. So figure out what you're trying to do versus if you're trying to really tell a story. Is it because if you've got people that are of wealth and you're creating a wealth conflict, then you've got to also represent people's understanding of those different characters' understanding of the wealth and value system. And again, this is probably maybe not be something you show on the page, but if somebody doesn't think twice about going and buying, if somebody's sitting in a high-end restaurant and one of your characters is looking from outside and they can't afford food from the food cart, you're showing something there in the economics between diverse worlds. So it's all about, what do people need and what does that particular character need and value?
There's another factor, which I would just say is stylistic in a way, and that depends on the pace of the book. basically, if you're running a page turner, which is based on intrigue, murder, bodies all over the place, you don't have to get too deeply into the economics. If you're writing something like I write, if you don't get into the economics, you're going to get crucified by your readers.
I'm gonna second what Jenny said, though. I mean, Lee's books are fabulous for reading for world building. I would also recommend Nalini Singh, because she has 3 separate series, and each of them are separate worlds. They are superimposed on a version of our world, but her world building in them are superb. Jenny's books, Jim's books, Gail's books, they are each a great, each of y'all have wonderful examples of how worlds can be built. And I will finish and should then shut up by saying also on Patricia Reedy's website, it's Patricia Reedy, WREDE.com. She has a list of world building questions. One of the best things I ever did for my creativity in terms of world building was to go through that list of questions. Most of it I did not need, but I thought about it because she had those questions. And that to me was invaluable, because I thought, okay, I don't need to know that. I do need to know that. And so that checklist, that list of world building tools is something I recommend to absolutely anybody who wants to build any kind of world. And I'll shut up now.
All right, as Jeannie said, obviously all of you were on here because you know something about world building and economics. So definitely, if people will check out all of your books, and thank you for all the resources you've mentioned. And let's just go around one last time and tell people where they can find you. And I'll go ahead and start with you, Jeannie.
You can find me at my website, www.ginnykoch.com. I'm also on Facebook, and I have 2 or 3 fan pages there. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Pinterest, and just basically Ginny Koch. There's only one other Ginny Koch I know of in the world, and if you stumble onto her instead of me, she's very sweet. She's German, but we know each other, and she will direct you to the right version of our name. And I'm pretty much everywhere, and where all books are sold.
Perfect. Lee?
Unlike Jenny, my only social media presence is my website, and that's L.E. Modesitt Jr. with no periods or anything else, just all run together, .com. And it's got pretty much all, well, not pretty much, it's got all of my books on it. It's got all the various series, including the brand new one, which will be out in November. And I'll just give that a plug. It's just, the series is called The Grand Illusion, and the first book is called Isolate, and it'll be out next October. Interestingly enough, and I didn't plan this, it'll be out on my birthday.
Yay!
Jim?
You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net. Of course, you're at ContinualConvention.com. And usually I'm around on Facebook, occasionally causing trouble, on Instagram, and I occasionally do show up on the hive of scum and villainy that is Twitter.
And finally, Jeannie.
Well, you can find me at jeanneadams.com, here on ConTinual fairly regularly, and on most social media platforms, but I spend way too much time on Twitter, so that's usually the best place to find me if you're a social media hound.
Hive of scum and villainy, like I said.
Scum and villainy.
All right.
It's where I like to hang out, you know?
And we'll have Gail's information up also at the end of the episode here. So again, I want to thank everyone for coming in, and thank all of you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.